Hey everyone, I am in a very tiny garden, which right now is filled with cleavers and chickweed. And we're going to talk about both up close with an emphasis on chickweed. Okay, so right now it is early May, so about mid-spring here in the mid-Atlantic Piedmont, and I am in Baltimore City right now. So this is certainly one of the most humblest of all gardens, very tiny. And there has been a low carpet of these two wild greens, cleavers and chickweed, underneath, all this kale and herbs. There's some yarrow in here. So there's been a low green carpet of these two wild greens underneath all the planted plants, pretty much all winter and spring. They're starting to get tall now, and both of these greens I consider early spring greens. They come up in the very early spring when it's still cool out, much before any greens you could possibly plant would come up. Okay, so wild greens are the first greens you're going to be eating in the early spring. Okay, before before your lettuces and kales could possibly be big enough to harvest leaves from if they're newly planted. Okay, so I am always counting on these and other wild greens in the early spring as my staples, as my green leaf staples. Okay, and we're gonna take a close look at each of them just so you know what they are. Those of you who aren't already familiar with this plant will introduce you, and then afterwards I'm really going to talk about seeding both of these plants and how to encourage them in your garden, how to live with them as semi-cultivated plants, which is epically important. So cleavers is a common plant. You often find it in gardens and yards, as a so-called weed. And right now it is quite tall because it's mid-spring, so it's getting ready to flower and go to seed. So we're going to take a close look just for those who aren't familiar with cleavers. So if I get in here, already these plants are cleaving to me. They're sticking. Look, like how much they stick to your skin. It's amazing. So that's where the name comes from. They feel like they have spines, but it's not exactly spines. It's just like these little hooks on the leaves that grab you. So for one, cleavers cleave. They grab you. The other, let's see if we can get a better focus. There we go. The other very distinguishing feature of cleavers is that, as you can see, all these leaves, this leaf right here, and this leaf right here, and this leaf, and this leaf, and all these, they are all coming out of the stem like a wheel, like a wagon wheel. Okay, so many leaves coming out of the stem right at the same point right here. We call that point a node. Any joint on a plant where new growth is happening, we call a node, N-O-D-E. So when many, like 3 or more leaves are coming out from a node of a plant, a joint of a plant, all at once, we call that whorled. We call those leaves whorled leaves, W-H-O-R-L, or L-E-D, whorled, which means they're like whirling around the stem. And that arrangement in plants is very rare. It's very unusual. Very few plants have whorled leaves. So that strange feature of cleavers and the clinginess of it makes it very easy to get to know this plant if you're a beginner. So cleavers is filling this whole area right now. Some of it is quite small, like down low in here. Some of it is quite tall and large like this. And as you can see on the top, these cleavers haven't started to bloom yet. There's no sign of little teeny weeny green flowers. The flowers are not going to be big and showy on this. They're going to be barely noticeable, but they will look different from the leaves. They're close though. So right now, all of this plant is still tender. It hasn't gotten tough and seedy yet. So if you watch the video on meristem, you can follow up with this cleaver by realizing that all of this is meristem. This is all meristematic, tender young growth. Pretty much all these cleavers in here. So I can just pick whole stems like that. For me, usually about that much is very tender for eating, and I do eat them raw. Just chew them well. They can cleave to your mouth. I do eat a lot of cleavers raw. I've always loved them. Or you can cook them and it'll get rid of that cleaving texture that you don't like so much. So all of this is still meristematic and tender, and this is what I go for when I'm harvesting cleavers to eat them. And now we're going to go over and take a look at chickweed. Now there is quite a lot of chickweed in this garden, and you can see it here all underneath these little kale plants. The chickweed is really like a ground cover underneath the planted vegetables here. And even though it's mid-spring, chickweed is still hanging around. Often chickweed does not last long. It comes up in the very early spring. Sometimes in the southeast, it can stick around all winter because if the weather is pretty mild. Chickweed is a cold weather green. It likes the cold weather. So that means it comes up in the late fall when the weather starts to get cold. Depending on, whether the ground gets covered in snow or not during the winter, it can hang around a little bit all winter long or disappear under snow and come back again in the early spring. Then disappear again once it gets warm. So chickweed is really one of the earliest greens that I'm eating every single year in the spring. It's one of the most reliable. It is one of the greens that I depend on, that when I don't have chickweed in my life, I feel very impoverished. So for those who aren't familiar, we'll take a closer look. So some of these chickweeds are still tender and perfect for eating. Here's a great example. So I'm going to just take this whole stem so you can see it. Okay, so here's a whole stem of chickweed, and this is the common chickweed, Stellaria media. There are other chickweeds indeed. The reason it's called Stellaria media, botanically, is Stellaria means stars, and media means little. So over here where this one is flowering, these little white flowers. Come on, focus. They look like little stars. That's where the name comes from. So this plant is named Little Stars after those adorable flowers. But when chickweed is tender for eating is before it flowers. That's the case with most plants. So for those who aren't familiar with chickweed, what we have going on are two leaves, this leaf and this leaf, two leaves coming out of the same spot on the plant, the same joint. So it's not whorled like cleavers, there's just two of them. So we call this opposite leaves, where there's two leaves coming out of the same joint, opposite leaves. Chickweed always has opposite leaves, and if you look very closely, its other amazing feature, tricky to focus that much, if you can see this one single line of hairs along the stem. You might notice the hairs don't actually go all the way around the stem. They're just in one single line along one side of the stem. It's very bizarre and unique to chickweed. The leaves are not hairy. They're almost sort of waxy, very crunchy, tender, and bright green. That's our common chickweed. And this is about the amount that I'm eating in the cold season. It's very tender. Okay. I'll just eat this whole thing. This whole thing is meristematic. I'll put it in my mouth right now. Very good. Some of these chickweed are starting to flower. So you can see this one. It did make some flowers,
which got pollinated because, focus, I see these little seed pods on here. So these were flowers, they got pollinated, they closed back up, and they're starting to form seeds in there. So this chickweed is like on its way, but you can still eat this. You know, it's still tender enough. That's still totally edible, even though it's on its way out. If we go over here, more in the sun, however, we will find chickweed that looks very, very different. So this is also chickweed. See, it's not all bunched up and squatty like this one is. It's almost like it's elongated an incredible amount. It is elongated a lot. Gotten lighter in color. Look at that. Really elongated. There's one brown seed right there. And gosh, I mean, this is just really getting tough at this point. It has really gone to seed, meaning the flowers have been pollinated. It's creating seed pods now. All of its energy is focused on making that seed now. So this is just not the chickweed that I'm eating. And often people notice chickweed in their garden when it looks like this. This is really past its prime for eating, but it's in the seed stage, which is very important, and I'm going to talk about next.
Okay everyone, so as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, wild edible greens dominate early spring. That is their kingdom, okay? What I mean by that is, at least here in the mid-Atlantic, March is usually what I'm calling early spring. It varies year to year, but from early March to the end of March, I'm usually calling early spring, where we might still be getting freezes or frosts at night, maybe even a late snowstorm or two, or it could already be getting warm. It's that in-between season. So March, April here, categorize early spring, kind of early spring into mid-spring. So during that time, a lot of these wild greens are coming up very, very quickly. They're filling up every nook and cranny much, much, much sooner than perennial, so long-lived perennial plants will be putting up their greens. Now, even in mid-spring, right now we're entering mid-spring, a lot of the perennial wild greens are just exploding. So like nettles, like sochan, things like that. So spring is the time when there are just so many greens exploding all around you, everywhere, in every habitat, in the fields, in the river bottoms, in the forest edges, inside the forest, that it makes your brain explode. You know, it's just the time to become awash in chlorophyll after a long winter. You're just saturated in green stuff and all the vitamins and minerals, and you know, there's no, other than organ meats, like eating eyeballs and livers and stuff like that, other than organ meats, and I don't know, maybe blue-green algae, there's really no other more densely vitamin and mineral rich foods than fresh wild greens. They're it. That's what we're supposed to be eating all the time, but specifically in the spring, okay? So wherever I am, which is always changing, I live a life of constant change, which could oscillate from, you know, the expansiveness and freedom of the mountains and the countryside down to the smallness and the enclosedness of cities where I am right now. So regardless of where I am, anywhere in the southeast, mid-Atlantic area, most of the East Coast, excluding Florida, I expect to see chickweed in the early spring and of course in the fall. And I look forward to it. It's one of the greens that I'm happiest to see. Like, oh, chickweed! You know, it's probably one of the 5 handfuls of greens that I've probably eaten the most bulk of in my life. You know, like, cause I've just, you know, I mean, maybe probably nettles and garlic mustard are up there. There's a couple others that are up there. But just in terms of just mass of chickweed that I have eaten regularly, you know, it's up there. And one reason is because it's so abundant, and it's one of the first greens to be tender and edible of the year. And another reason is that it's always close to me because it's almost always going to be in my garden. So whatever's the space of earth that I'm cultivating more so than other spaces, like where I'm planting my kale seeds, things like that. So chickweed likes to grow in those spaces that are very close to humans, the spaces that we cultivate and disturb the most. So it's a common friend. It's a plant you're going to interact with often every single day because it's going to be very close to where you live, the garden nearest to you. You don't have to go out into the woods and the fields necessarily to find chickweed. So I always encourage chickweed in every garden I plant and tend. Okay, whether that's a little teeny tiny humble garden like this or large expanses of gardens on, more of a larger farm or homestead. It's the same. I expect a carpet of chickweed in the early spring always, no matter where I am. And often my wish is fulfilled, okay, because in the soil, okay, soil has something called a seed bank. It's this incredible thing nature has. It's almost like Mother Nature has her deck of cards, like her, she's like, I don't know, a card game, and she has her cards, but she's got a bazillion of them that she's got to herself. She can like play any card that she wants whenever it's time to play that card, when the situation is right. Those cards that she's holding are the seeds. There's a bazillion million seeds of many different plant species that just exist in soil, dormant. It's called the seed bank. And when the conditions are right, when it's time to play that card, like the temperature is right, the season is right, the moisture is right, the conditions of the soil, like pH and pollutants and stuff like that, the seeds that are the right ones will germinate and grow. Okay, so it's not like, that's why you don't have to throw down seeds all the time to make plants grow. Nature does it because she has her seed bank, her cards, and her stash of cards ready to go. So chickweed seeds should already be abundant in the seed bank of most disturbed and human-tended areas. So as soon as the conditions are right, they will germinate and grow, which is the case of all wild-growing plants. That's how Earth works. Occasionally, I might be in a place where there is no chickweed, like just on that particular farm or that particular landscape. There just happens to be no chickweed there. It's a terrible thing when it happens. It's horrible. That can happen simply because chickweed just wasn't introduced into that place, or if an area is so relentlessly weeded year after year, meaning the weeds are pulled up before they have a chance to produce their own seeds and drop them. So they're weeded relentlessly year after year, or the soil is poisoned relentlessly year after year. If some eradication efforts have just gone on hardcore year after year after year, then yes, certain seeds can be eliminated from the seed bank and not come back. And when that happens with many wild greens, wild edible and medicinal herbs, I find that a real tragedy. So, I really encourage moving around chickweed seeds, and this plant specifically, in your gardens. So this is a very Juliet thing, a very Juliet de Berkeley-Levy thing, the late great herbalist, to be carrying around paper bags of seeds of fast-growing greens, wild greens. Is very much her thing as she was living as a nomad. Specifically for chickweed, the reason I am encouraging this is one, because it's very quick to germinate. You'll get edible greens very, very quickly in the early spring, much more quickly than you will get your cultivated greens to a stage where you can eat them. And also because chickweed is one of the very few mild tasting wild greens of early spring. Most wild greens have stronger flavors than cultivated greens. That's one reason greens became cultivated many different reasons, but one reason was to, over time, make them taste milder. So wild greens tend to be either very spicy, if many wild mustards are very spicy, or very bitter. There's some wonderful bitters in the wild greens world, like dandelion, and even some mustards, like wintercrust mustard, Barbaria vulgaris, very bitter. Some wild greens are very sour. There's many sour wild greens, like wood sorrels. So mild tasting wild greens are kind of the exception. They're more unusual, and chickweed is one of those, where it just kind of has a very mild, earthy, spinachy flavor. You can kind of use it any way you would use spinach. So I usually pick, a great big basket of it every other day, and the chickweed would be the base of a salad. Like the majority of my salad would be chickweed, and then I could add some bitters and some spicy and some other stuff. Or if I'm doing cooked greens, in the past years ago, sometimes when I'd be harvesting so much, chickweed can get very tall sometimes when it's in a happy, shady place, like along rock walls or the edges of a house where it gets the dew stays around longer in the morning and the shade. Chickweed, the tender meristematic portions of chickweed can be, a foot tall. You just take a pair of scissors in your hands and gently break it. Don't pull it out because you want it to keep growing back. But just break or cut the meristematic sections and gather just an enormous load of it. So, I've made quiches that were just pretty much solid cooked chickweed with, little bits of egg sneaked in there, or pizza, make some pizza dough and just cook down some chickweed, so it's just like a solid bed of cooked chickweed on top of there. So really any way you can think of using spinach, you can use chickweed, okay? So it's very agreeable, very tasty to eat. So I'm going to zoom in again on chickweed seeds to show you what you can collect. Okay, if you're planning on moving around, or if you're moving to a new garden and you don't know that chickweed's going to be there, or someone who doesn't have chickweed in their garden and you want to get this chickweed cycle going in that other place. By cycle, I mean this dependable pattern where you're planting all your other stuff in your garden and you're expecting chickweed to come up in the late fall, be tender enough for you to pick. It will be in between all of your plantings. It will die back down again over the winter, and then you expect it to come back up in the early spring so that you can be eating it before your other stuff comes up. So it becomes a predictable part of your garden cycle that you get to know and you rely on and you love year after year. It becomes a part of your garden, a part of your garden's rhythm. That's what I'm talking about. So let's go take a look at chickweed seeds again.
So we are back again at the pretty seedy chickweed, the chickweed that's already flowered and started to form its seed pods. There's quite a lot of it over here where there's more heat here, with the stones absorbing the sun every day. This chickweed is getting more heat every day, so it's quickest to flower. But even over here, a lot of this chickweed has been flowering quite a bit. You can see some of these seed pods are starting to turn brown. Most of the seed pods are still green. So there are some mature seeds happening, particularly around here. Like there's a mature seed pod. Here's an almost mature seed pod, quite brown. But whatever chickweed is looking the brownest and driest. So at that point, what you can do, I could certainly let this chickweed go a bit longer. But since I do know that some of these seed pods are mature, that one right there is going to have some mature seeds inside of it. Keep in mind, when I say that's a seed pod, inside of this are the seeds. And the seeds are so tiny. They're little tiny black specks. So you're not going to be able to individually collect little tiny seeds. So what you would do, honestly, is just take this whole bundle of chickweed, pull it out. Okay, so you have this just kind of messy little bundle here, And I mean, honestly, I would wait until it's a little browner than this, but if you were in a hurry, you could collect it when it's still pretty green like this, as long as it still has some brown colored pods. Collect a whole bunch of this, just a lot, and put it all in a brown paper bag where it can really breathe. You don't want to put it in a plastic bag because it still needs to dry out. It's just going to rot and mold if you put it in plastic. So just this whole mass, this whole bundle, and 10 times this amount. Put loosely in a brown paper bag so it can continue to dry out in the brown paper bag. And more of the seeds will continue to mature. Some of the seeds will kind of fall out into the paper bag, but just keep it in that paper bag until you're at your new place, your new garden. And that could be years from now. You can save chickweed in a bag like that for years, and then when you're ready, take out what then will be a dried brown mass of, it'll be like straw with all these little seeds kind of in there, and just take it to your new garden and just shake it all over the place and just drop it all in there. Just lay it all down and shake it all over the place. And that will effectively reseed chickweed in that area. And you should see chickweed coming up that next cold season. And once chickweed is in the soil there, that chickweed that has come up, let it go to flower. Don't pull it up once it gets seedy. Modern day gardening culture tells us, oh, once plants flower, like kale, once it starts to flower, get rid of it because it's no good anymore and you don't want it to go to seed. There's this great fear of seeds in our culture, which I think is linked to a fear of wildness, because we want to enact control because we've been controlled as humans. So, if you follow this wild way, part of that, I will tell you, involves becoming a seed worshiper, okay? Seed is the source of life and the guarantee of continued new life and good life. So I'm quite the seed worshiper. So I'm not pulling up all this chickweed right when it starts to get seedy. I'm letting it get seedy because I'm like, heck yes, make a bunch of seeds, drop a bunch of seeds. I want to make sure chickweed stays in this area, forever. Okay. And just while we're at it, I'm going to do a quick mention on kale and cultivated garden brassicas, meaning garden mustards, which is kales and collards and cabbage and rutabaga and radishes and broccoli and cauliflower and pretty much all the garden greens are mustards, meaning they're in the mustard family, which is also called the brassicas and the crucifers. Botanically, it is the Brassicaceae, which is the brassica family. So remember, just like that video on meristem, I showed garlic mustard starting to flower, to form its flowering head, which is a brassica. Here's some kale, garden kale that I planted that is doing the exact same thing, right? So it was shorter because the weather's getting warmer. It's starting to form a tall stalk, getting tall, and it is forming flower buds, which are going to open and eventually be something more like this, yellow flowers. So I treat my garden cultivated brassicas pretty much the same as wild brassicas, meaning once they do start to flower, I'm not ripping them up. I worship them once they start to flower, right? I will just treat this as another vegetable. So at this stage, I would just snap this top part of the kale plant, which is all meristematic. About this, from here to about here, is going to be all meristem. Down low here, the stalk is going to be tough. But I just snap that whole top portion, and it's like harvesting little broccolinis, okay? Or tiny little tiny little broccoli heads, okay? And then I'll just steam those and eat them. And I might do that from a whole bunch. And then the plant will shoot out more shoots to flower because it wants to flower to create seeds. Plants have a deep need to create seed to continue themselves. So you still will get seed, but you can just keep plucking the flowering heads as they form eventually the plant will get away from you and be like, okay, we've got to flower, enough of this. And then I'll stop harvesting all my little bunches of broccolini things and let it flower. Right now, because I'm getting ready to move on, the seeds are more valuable to me than the vegetable, because the forests and river bottoms are just such an explosion of wild vegetables right now that I have no shortage of green vegetables. And I want to make sure that these flower quickly, form seeds that I can then collect and be on my way on my travels. Because this particular kale, I've had a relationship with these seeds for about 10 years, planting the same seeds and harvesting the seeds from the same kales year after year, sometimes skipping a few years. So it's good to me to keep saving the same seeds from a plant I have a relationship with. These certainly are not the largest kale I've ever grown in my life. They might be the smallest kale I've ever grown in my life, but the demands of funny city living. But it's all worth it because I'll still have the seeds. And I'll just show you, all these little kales in here. They're all doing the same thing, making these little flower heads. And I could, snap all these little top sections if I wanted to. Have a nice snap here, have a nice little vegetable. That one too, just like garlic mustard. Snap that whole section there. All right, seed worship, everyone. It is the source of your life. It is the source of my life. Seeds. It's time for us all to become seed worshipers again. That's all for now. See you next time.